Hello, my name is Hugo Prévost. Welcome to SVGA, your PC retro gaming podcast. With me, as always, is Robert. Hello, Robert.
Hey, Hugo. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Oh, doing good.
That's good to know. We have a special guest today. So, Alex Lotz, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. You are the managing producer at Ziggurat. And today we have you on the show because Ziggurat just announced, I think a few weeks back now, that they will be remastering. There's a difference between the two terms, but yeah, there will be a remaster of Killing Time, which is a FPS game from 1995. So yeah, thank you for being on the show. Ziggurat is known for new games, of course, but also for keeping older games alive. What is the motivation behind this interest for retro gaming?
I think it comes from a number of different places, but we, call ourselves a new and old video game company. And to me, a timeless work of art, whether it's a book or a movie or a game, is timeless usually for a reason. And so it's often worth going back and experiencing what it was like in its original form. But in the case of video games, technology has changed so much. Game design conventions have changed so much. The ways people expect to interface with the game have changed so much in the last, 50 years, but also even in the last 10 or 15 years. It's such a rapidly changing medium that, sometimes bringing a game back exactly as it was or exactly as you remember it doesn't make sense on modern hardware or doesn't make sense to a modern audience. So you try to modernize it in some respects, either with updating the control scheme or updating the interface, or if you have all the source code, you can make some deeper and wider changes. Like in the case of Killing Time, it wasn't really a game where you had free look mouse aiming, which you would think, every PC first person shooter would have that. But this was a game originally made for 3DO. And, when it came over to PC, there were certain things they changed and certain things they didn't. And so I think you'll see a lot of updates to that game in particular. But at Ziggurat, I would say we do both. There's cases where we try to be as true to the original as possible, and there's cases where we make some light enhancements just to make it feel okay for modern audiences. And then there's games where it's like, we love what's there, but it needs a radical update or a new game altogether. Right?
I guess kind of like a two-part question. Like the first is, well, what was it about Killing Time that brought you to it, and what kind of approach are you going to take with this one? The way you're talking about, like, are you going to totally be tearing it down, building it back up, or is it just sort of one of those things where you just do a few enhancements?
Yeah, Killing Time's been kind of in Ziggurat's catalog for quite a while. I think it was originally owned by a company called Tomo, who also had like the Retroism brand, where they were kind of one of the early developers to focus on retro games for digital distribution through Steam and GOG. So like an older, a game that feels pretty close to the original has been on Steam for a while, of Killing Time, and that one was originally ported by Nightdive as well, one of the earliest ports. So that one's straight up like the original, but one thing that attracted it to it was, in this case, we not only had the rights to the game, but we did have a substantial amount of source code. And so we went to Nightdive and said, like, hey, what would you all be able to do with this in terms of, because they've been doing so many amazing Kex engine updates to the games like Quake and Turok and things like that. So we're like, well, with the assets that we have, what could be updated? And, for those that know the game, like the 3DO and DOS versions were pretty different. So we were like, going to them like, hey, can we make a new PC version that maybe has some of what makes the 3DO version great and modernizes it to that extent? But in terms of like why bring this content back, like, one, we think it holds up really well. Two, like, there's a pretty significant amount of new horror games coming out, and we see a lot of overlap between people interested in retro games and horror games, and that can be retro in the sense of actually coming out 20 or 30 years ago, or retro just in the sense of aesthetics. So like now when I say like I play boomer shooters or I enjoy boomer shooters, it's not necessarily that I'm not necessarily talking about Duke Nukem. I might be talking about a bunch of new games that are like aesthetically styled to be boomer shooters or that are inspired by it. And some of those games are like some of the most, kind of cutting edge, innovative first person shooters out there. And some of them are like roguelikes, and some of them, in a bunch of different directions. But we felt like, the way that this game uses full motion video, the way the game uses storytelling, and it's kind of like sprawling level design and like its sense of humor and its kind of over the top gory aesthetics, it sits and fits well with a lot of modern horror game audiences and kind of the retro flavor of it, and the resurgence in boomer shooters lately. So it just felt like one of those games. A similar thing with when we rebooted Slave Zero as Slave Zero X, where like it almost feels like this IP could be more relevant now than it was at the time because of the way tastes have gone and the way that the PC and independent gaming has gone in general.
It's interesting what you're saying about horror games, because I'm of the idea that if I play a horror game, I have to be able to shoot the bad guys. I have to be able to fight back, because the types of games where I think Outlast is one of them, is where you have to constantly flee and hide. I hate this. I just want to take a stick and smack the monsters in the face. So yeah, very interesting to see Killing Time coming back. I remember playing, I think, the demo back in the day when I was quite young at that time. And yeah, do you think that, obviously you've talked about how the game was already in your catalog and how it was already possible to play it on Steam and GOG and so on. Do you feel that in that context, there is still an appetite for that new version of the game?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you from what I've played, it's a significant difference and upgrade to the original that's on Steam right now, but also having it be accessible to console audiences in a way that makes sense for them, and having like, I can't speak too much to the different types of releases, but presumably there'll be physical versions available for people at some point. So not everyone only wants to be able to get something digitally. But yeah, I think it's going to make a fairly faithful adaptation of the original available in a way that makes a lot more sense to people who are used to playing from a modern input devices. And, Nightdive has a really amazing track record of doing this with quite a few games, right? It's like, I didn't think about like Doom 64 being like a great modern release, but it does make a lot of sense. And obviously Quake and Quake 2, which what I would say briefly nerd out about is like, I really like that those games have modding support. Like even if you bought the Nintendo Switch or the Xbox or the PS4 version, you can download mods that are officially supported by Bethesda onto the console versions. Mm-hmm. So it's been pretty cool to see some things that in my mind were like, oh, that's a PC gamer thing, is like modding, right? Or like, oh, that's a console gamer thing. And, like when you think about like the game Deus Ex did have a PS2 release, and that sounds very weird and very foreign. But nowadays, I think the audiences are starting to merge more, and there are people who are like, there's games I like to play on console, and there's games I like to play on PC. And if we could take a game that's been very much thought of as a PC game and have it make sense on console, then I think that benefits people who prefer one or the other, but also people like myself who is like, oh, there's certain games I only want to play on PC, certain games I only want to play on Steam Deck, certain games I only want to play on Switch. But if I have it available on all of them, then even better, right?
How do you kind of deal with the different expectations of gamers now? Like we played a lot of boomer shooters. Like we played Dark Forces for our last episode, and one of the things that's interesting is like the way those older games have a lot of friction in just sort of level design and how you get through sort of the game itself, where like you don't have the white or the yellow paint to show you the way. Like as an easy example, like how do you deal with the different expectations that gamers have now to what games offered then, just because totally different mentality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think of it in terms of another form of accessibility. Like the word accessibility can mean a lot of different things. One of them is like, is it accessible on the console that I play, or are the difficulty levels adjustable, or does it have colorblind options? But even in this case of just like, how much of a difficulty curve is there? How much does the game hold your hand? How much does the game guide you through the experience? And in some cases, like there's games that we re-release where we don't have source code and we can't, just like, you want that original experience, that's what you're going to get, and there's not much modification you can do there. But in the cases where there is source code, I've seen studios where a very hardcore game is, they offer some kind of difficulty mode that can make it, how do I say it, able to be enjoyed by people who maybe don't have as much experience playing in that genre. Because, sometimes the best known games in particular genres, they're designed specifically for the most hardcore fans of that genre. So if you try to bring it to a larger audience who's like, oh yeah, I don't really play that many first person shooters, but I heard this is the one to play. And suddenly they're jumping into this water like, I don't speak this language that the game is asking me to speak. I'd say it depends a lot on the title, like how much you can do as a designer in terms of like a first time user experience or giving people a gradual on ramp. In the case of like a retro game like this that maybe didn't have much of a tutorial and it just kind of throws you in there and asks you to explore and lets you die over and over again. I mean, the good thing is you can at least save wherever you want to save and create multiple save files, go through that. But that is a good question. I think there's obviously not a one size fits all solution, but I see it happening more common now, even for people that are working in what are considered more hardcore genres. They're finding ways to make it more accessible to people. So, for instance, I'm like a fighting game person, and one thing that people enjoy about fighting games is how difficult the execution is and how much practice and repetition you have to do to like get the difficult combos down. But some people, they're like, well, this game's never going to be accessible to me, or I'm going to have to practice for months before I can even start doing what's interesting, start having a real competition. But now you're seeing like the biggest fighting games in the world, like Street Fighter 6 has a modern control scheme, which is more simplified inputs, but they managed to make it viable and make it balanced. So somebody in a tournament match can play a modern control scheme versus a classic control scheme. So that's all to say, like, I think there's ways to do it without compromising the integrity of the original game, right? And without insulting the people who maybe don't need those affordances and don't need those on-ramps.
When it comes to remastering or remaking a game, because we can understand, I think, more easily the fact that, for example, you take The Last of Us and you change the texture so that they are in higher definition. So it's in our heads, maybe it's easier because the game came out a few years ago, and now it's maybe more easier to just switch the texture. But when it comes to a game like Killing Time, going all the way back to 1995, and of course, you said that you have part of the source code for years. You had some, obviously, it was in the catalog, but how does it work basically? Because 3DO, the company that developed the game and published it, has been closed for 21 years now. So it's part of that era where unless there's some magic involved, maybe you try to, for example, you take a game from that era, from 1995, 1986, whatever, and you try to install it on your modern PC. It's usually just won't work. And so how does a company go through, what are the steps basically in order to be able to take, once again, something from that era and just be able to, in 2024, to say, oh, here is an HD version that's compatible for widescreen and mouse look and on different consoles and so on?
Yeah, it depends on like the assets that you have available. So in the case of like Killing Time, for example, the version that people are used to playing on PC, they had like photographs of like real actors like acting as the different enemies, and they down-resed those into these very compressed sprites. And so it's like taking a pretty high-res image and compressing it into something low-res that can function. But now that hardware capacity has the ability to do something more high-res, it's like, well, wait a minute. If we have those original photographs and we don't have to compress them, can we put them in the game in a less compressed format? So now there's things that used to look very sprite-like that in the updated version look closer to like, oh, I can tell that's a real person wearing a costume, like dressed up as the zombie. And so, not everyone's going to have the assets to do that. And in some cases, it's like, well, okay, we want to up-res all these textures. Do you paint them all from scratch, or do you use some kind of AI upscaling algorithm to very mixed results depending on what type of assets you're trying to do. And even if you do upgrade them, like it can be very difficult to preserve the feel, even if like you're trying very hard to, like, I think I remember reading about when they were remastering Persona 4, I believe it was, there's like scenes that were very foggy on PS2 because PS2 like handled fog in a good way. It's like why Silent Hill 2 worked so well and all that. And they were like having trouble getting it to perform well on modern consoles because it was like modern console architecture doesn't necessarily handle that transparency as well once you're using like the super high res outputs. And it's like there's so much more rendering that has to happen there. So it's this weird thing of like games can be so specific to their hardware that it's like, how do you translate that over technically, but also in a way that like feels the same? I don't know, I feel like I'm going a little off track from your original question there, but in terms of killing time, like I think we were fortunate to have those original assets, but if you don't, then it's like, yeah, you're often left evaluating, like, do we start from the ground up or, you know, what can we do? I mean, I've seen games that got remakes that were like a year or two later than, or like within 5 years of the original, and like it totally didn't feel right at all. Like weirdly, there was like a version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 on Xbox, I believe it was, that was like an HD version that definitely ran at a higher frame rate and looked better than the PS2 versions, or no, PS1 version for sure, but even like the PC and Dreamcast version of the second game. But the physics were all wrong. Like as somebody who had played that game a lot, like there was combos I couldn't do on Xbox that I could do on PlayStation because whenever they ported over the controls or the mechanics, there were things that just were not one-to-one. And then when this new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 came out more recently, I forget the company that was eventually bought by Blizzard that did it. Anyway, it was like all ground up remake, HD graphics, new music, new state, but still very much like 1 and 2. And they got the physics right in that game. So I'm like, this game that was 5 years apart from the original didn't do the physics as well as somebody that was 15 or 20 years later. So there's a lot that can be lost in translation, whether you're doing a full remake or even what you consider like a light port. And as somebody who's looked at a lot of retro catalogs, like there's a game like Darkman or like RoboCop, a bunch of these like Ocean Software games from the mid 90s or early 90s, where they released like a Genesis and a Super Nintendo and an MSX version and an Atari version and a Commodore 64 version, all within like 8 months of each other. And if you play them all, they're all totally different. Like you can see there's like some of the same source code there, but whoever was doing the port was like treating it as a new development and treating it like, well, what can I do with this hardware? And you just adapt to that. So I don't know. I find that fascinating and I find it fun to kind of like go back and look at that stuff. But yeah, it's a lot to consider in terms of like how much you want to stay loyal to the originals versus how much you want to adapt to the hardware capacity that we have now.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that the 3DO version was different than the PC version, and you're trying to sort of find a way to meld those together to bring kind of the best of both. Like what was different about the 3DO version that did have that kind of that flavor you want to bring forward?
I think it did handle the FMV sprites differently from the PC version. I'm trying to remember what the other differences were. This has mostly been Nightdive's department for the most part. But I will say, like, to me, from the footage I've seen of 3DO and of PC and from directly playing this new build, I do think this one kind of stands as its own. Like, I'm glad that it has the Resurrected subtitle so that it like will be treated as a separate title. But yeah, it's like, I think the people that play the 3DO complained that the PC didn't handle the narrative and the video aspects of it as well as they did on 3DO. So I think, yeah, as a DOS game, it was like at that point, the FMV technology was not as advanced, or at least what they had access to at that studio at that time. So I do think of them as like almost two different games, but I also think of this new one as a different game, which is very much built out of the substance of the original, but stands on its own in terms of the way the controls work and how it feels to play it. So,
we've talked about revamping the mechanics, and we've talked about game design, but I had the time yesterday to rewatch a review of Killing Time. I guess I don't know which version, but still an older version, of course, of the game. And there were some comments about not necessarily bad mechanics, but some wonky stuff, the jumping, for example, or sometimes you get slightly stuck in walls or crates. And I can understand that you want to bring a nostalgia feeling. It's obviously one of the reasons why you're doing this. But is there a department of minor annoyances that there's people in there trying to correct these not necessarily game breaking mistakes, but slightly things that can piss off people slightly?
Yeah, I'll say like for other games I've worked on with Ziggurat as well, there's times where we're working with the original developer to make the new version, or in this case with a different developer to make the new version. And you go back and look at it and it's like, okay, kind of everybody in the community agrees this part is a bug, or this part came out in a way that was unintended by the original developers. So that stuff, when you have the source code, it's usually like pretty straightforward. Like, yeah, this is a quality of life improvement, or this is a stability improvement. Like, let's go ahead and fix it. Then you get into stuff where it was like, we have data or we have feedback that shows a whole bunch of the people that played this game, they didn't get past level 6 because level 6 has this encounter with some kind of weird platforming section that is just like, everybody was like, nah, I'm done, I'm out. I'm not going to push through this. And so that brings up the question, like, okay, do you make at least one mode of the game where that gets toned down? Or is that compromising the integrity of the original difficulty? Because now it's like, the one I'm thinking of in particular, Blood Rain Betrayal, we brought back as Blood Rain Betrayal Fresh Bites, and we worked with WayForward, who made the original, and they also did the Fresh Bites version. And like the main value add was we got voice acting into the game, but we also there were a couple sequences in the game where everybody on the development team was just like, yes, we think this turned out too hard. So the default mode in Blood Rain Betrayal Fresh Bites is that part's toned down a bit, but you can also toggle back like a classic mode where it's like exactly as you remember it. If you want to be able to say like, oh yeah, that thing that I could never get past 10 years ago, I went back and I finally beat it in the new version, right? So yeah, I mean, we look for ways to make quality of life updates. And if it's like a design decision that's like, everybody would like the game better if it was this, or, one thing we look at is sometimes the community will have already modded it in some respect, right? Or it's like, right, everyone agreed, so like we all just made our own mod to fix that. So if we see something where it's enough of a consensus, then we're more likely to make the fix in that case. But yeah, it's a case by case, and it is like a design decision that usually is a discussion between the developer and the publisher.
That makes sense. Well, one of the interesting things that I've found now is I've started using Moonlight to stream from my PC to, sometimes it'll just be my laptop, but other times I'll cast to my Apple TV, like in the living room. And I actually played, not to keep going back to this one, but I played Dark Forces like on a controller, sitting on my couch on like a 65-inch TV, which was a very different experience than like on a 15 or 17-inch monitor, like a CRT when I was a kid. And I'm just wondering how you kind of, with a game like this, especially when you're talking about dealing with sprites, like how much do you think about all the different ways that people are going to play now? Because it's much different than, like even talking about, you got the Switch and everything. You're not just like, okay, everyone's going to be on a CRT monitor, it's going to look like this. Like how much do you have to think about how differently people play now because of all the options?
I've had to think about it a lot, I guess you could say. But when I was starting at Ziggurat, one of the things that I did a lot was bringing DOS games to Steam. And we do that through DOSBox, which is like open source, really fantastic DOS emulator. But if you go into a DOSBox configuration file, it asks you like, well, what kind of machine are you going to emulate? And there's like 15 different CPUs and 15 different hardware infrastructures. And it's like, there were programs that were made where it was like, if you ran it on a Tandy or you ran it on this kind of monitor or this kind of display, like it would handle the graphics differently. It would handle like the frame rate. And like also, it's like there's games where we got it up and running in DOSBox and we're playing it, and then we go and find a YouTube video of somebody playing it on original hardware, and we're like, wait a minute, like it doesn't sound or look like that at all when we're playing it in emulation. And then like we start making adjustments. Like I still remember this game, Bop and Wrestle. It had like these weird kind of clicky sounds during the combat, but we figured the audio was emulating fine because when you open the game, there's like a little opening jingle that was playing perfectly. But then we found video of somebody playing like the combat on original hardware, and there was like voiced audio that was just like this clicking sound before, and it sounded more like people like grunting, like like when they're getting hit by the other guy. And we're like, okay, we got to adjust our emulation settings to make it actually sound like what you remember. So there's that side of it from like the DOS emulation that I've had to work with a lot. And even within DOSBox, it's like there's what type of pixel scaling do you want to do? It's like you can scale it up this way, but is it going to use nearest neighbor scaling, or is it going to use a different kind of scaling, and how much of the edges do you want filed off? And that's why like you see a lot of like retro emulated products where they offer a CRT filter, right? Or it's like if you're like remembering how it was playing as a kid, you're like, now these sprites now look too clean. Like maybe I can add a filter to make it more like what I remember, or the feeling of playing it on original hardware. And there is also a different market for people who want to play on their PS2 with a CRT versus somebody who wants to play it, through their Apple TV on their 4K display. So can you account for all that in a single product? It's difficult. I mean, I think if Nightdive's doing a lot to offer a lot of different graphics options already in the builds that I've seen. But aside from that, like, yeah, there's always this push and pull between like preservation versus like what looks good to a modern display. I think of other examples where we encountered that. I guess the Blood Rain games was a big one because you could kind of get the old Blood Rain games running on PC, but there would be a lot of instability and some of the graphics wouldn't like scale that well. So when we worked with the original developers, they made a lot of adjustments to like, well, the original game, it would only allow this much bandwidth to this type of rendering, so we upped that, and it would only render this in such ways, and they would expand it to what was possible with both like modern displays, but also modern graphics cards and modern operating systems. So I don't know. It's like there's games also that came out like not that long ago, which hardware changes so much and so quickly that you're like, oh, okay. Like you wake up one morning and Steam is like, yeah, we don't support 32-bit Mac games anymore. And you're just like, oh, or like Apple's not supporting enough of their 32-bit applications in modern operating systems that you're just like, oh, I mean, like I bought 32-bit Apple games like not that long ago. And there's plenty of stuff in my Steam and GOG library that if I want to play the Apple version, it's 32-bit. And now I can't just do that natively within an Apple environment. And so, yeah. So again, that's the display thing and like the changes in hardware. It's something you just kind of gotta keep track of. And I don't know, some of the interesting people I've gotten to meet as developers, like they've been in the industry long enough where like, it's like, yeah, I've had, 20 different development kits, and each time you do it, it's like learning a new language. And I always find it fascinating too, that like the early games from a specific console generation usually look very different from the end game. Like if you see like what Commodore 64 games look like when that hardware was kind of first commercially available versus like what people were able to do on Commodore 64 in commercial games toward the end of its life, or in tech demos after the end of its life. It's just like bizarre, right? Like if you tell me to picture a Commodore 64 game in my head, like there's 10 different ways that it can look. So anyway, I know I'm kind of going off track a little bit there.
No, that's quite all right. We are now living a trend, I think, for the past maybe 10 years, maybe 15 or even more, with remakes, remasters, and also a bunch of new games, but new retro games, so-called boomer shooters. Even though we are not, either of us are boomers right now, but anyway. And there always, because in my head, there's always this sense of, we'll get to a point where we have enough. There's been enough games, there have been enough remasters and remakes and so on, enough slightly changed versions of Doom and so on. obviously you're trying to sell copies. You're hoping to find your niche. You're hoping to find your to be able to sell a bunch of copies of Killing Time, of course. But is there a sense of, I don't want to say fear, but is there one place where you're afraid of that the market will be saturated?
I mean, broadly, like as somebody who also plays games, I do feel like it's at a point where there are more games that I want to play coming out than I have time to play. And that's like as somebody who wants to go out of my way to buy and play these games, right? So as a publisher, then I look at that and I'm like, oh, okay. So like, even if we make an excellent, very competitive product that's compelling to people, there's going to be a certain amount of our consumers who are like, okay, I'll add that to my backlog, or I'll wishlist it up until the point that I can finally have time to play it. Or, plenty of people don't get around to playing something if it's not like top of their list until it comes to Game Pass or it comes to whatever PlayStation subscription they have. So like, yes, it's competitive in the sense of just like, if you're trying to think about the traditional release cycle of like, we want to have this coverage at this time, and then we hope that this is kind of the day where everybody's paying the most attention and has the most hype around our game. But there's also a lot of ways to bring games to people. It's like the audience and the amount of people engaging with it, it's like bigger than it's been before. I mean, I think in terms of like concurrent users, like maybe you could say there was like a bigger spike during COVID when like people were trapped inside and had nowhere else to go. And you can't expect like that amount of users in the long term unless there's another pandemic. But yeah, I think the interesting part right now in terms of saturation is a lot of the games that got funded during that time where investors were looking for something to invest in. And they're like, wow, video games is really taking off. Let's invest in video games. Some of those were on 2 or 3 year development cycles. And so they're like all kind of hitting the market at once. So I think it's like, if you want to look at the video game crash that occurred in like the 80s as like, oh, there's so many products out there and most of them are not good, and that's why consumers lost faith. I don't know if we would hit the same crash in the like having overabundance of good products where it's like maybe investors become a little more shy, which I think we are seeing. And like we're seeing a lot of layoffs and restructuring and a lot of downsizing. It's like if there's so many quality products coming out at once, then you have more competition and you have less market share because you're competing against all of those. But I think the long tail is like more promising now too, right? Where it's like if you have a well-defined product with a well-defined audience, there's lots of ways for it to reach people, whether it's through Game Pass or through PlayStation or through streaming services or through subscription models. And now we're seeing both like digital and physical. Like we are seeing a certain amount of people who are just like, yeah, I'm interested in that game, not just as a player, but also as a collector, right? And like, I also want to be able to play that game in 15 years from now when whatever cloud service it's on maybe doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, it's, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. I don't know what else to say besides that. I wouldn't say I'm like afraid, but it's just kind of like, we're seeing a lot of people in the publishing space kind of evaluate risk differently and evaluate the market differently than they were a couple of years ago. But that's only natural because it was in such a weird place a couple of years ago. And yeah.
So we have one last question before we end this interview. Let's go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. So I was just, I guess, just looking at Killing Time. Was there anything that like surprised you or you think will surprise players when they come back to it? Like, is there something there you're really looking forward for people to like find or rediscover or discover for the first time with this one?
If you've played the original, I think for sure you'll find it to be a significant update and a significant refresh, both like visually, like in the build that we have right now, you can toggle between kind of like the visual not enhanced versus enhanced modes and lighting versus not having lighting, and it's just like night and day, pretty incredible. And like, you know, they've been doing this for a while. Like Dark Forces is one that they did recently also, but yeah, I think it's a significant upgrade in that sense, and it feels great to play it even like as a keyboard and mouse player, like playing it with more modernized keyboard and mouse controls than what's in the original. Like the original kind of like has its charms, and you're just kind of like, oh, it's interesting that they decided to do it that way. But as like a more modern player, you're just like, okay, like this feels more natural, and this feels like something I can invest into more quickly. But aside from that, it's just like, I think it'll be a great way to experience the game. And I think if you compare it with playing the original or videos of the original, which, by the way, if you're getting it on PC, Steam, or GOG, you will be granted a copy of the original, or the one that's the current Killing Time on Steam and GOG. So if you want to go back and play test it back to back yourself, then you'll be able to. I think differences are pretty remarkable, and especially in terms of the visuals, and especially in terms of the controls. And that's what I know of so far. It's also still in development. So.
Alex Lotz, managing producer at Ziggurat, thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
And really appreciate it.
We're looking forward. I think it's still a plan for this year. This game is coming out later this year. Is that it?
That's correct.
That's great. So we're looking forward to Killing Time, looking forward to play it. In the meantime, thank you everyone for being here, for listening to this new episode of SVGA. Thank you, Robert, of course. And in the meantime, if you want to catch up on past episodes, we are on pf.ca and also on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Until next time.